Hi, this is Madeline with Mickelberry Gardens, and I am excited to talk more about our bee pollen. At Mickelberry Gardens, we're really committed to the health of honeybees and really all pollinating insects. You can see some of the icons of just a few of the nonprofits that we support, including the Honeybee Health Coalition, the American Apitherapy Society, and the Xerxes Society, which are all working towards helping to preserve bee health and protect pollinator habitat. First, I'll talk about what is bee pollen. Bee pollen comes from a really special and unique relationship between honeybees and plants. Plants produce pollen, and the pollen is really how the plants reproduce. And the plants have developed this really fascinating relationship with honeybees and all pollinating insects. So as the insects travel from flower to flower collecting the pollen, they're moving this pollen around from flower to flower and helping to increase pollination. So it's a really cool technique that plants have designed. Since plants can't move around, they've really recruited the help of insects and other pollinators to help do that work for them. So bee pollen is really a big part of that kind of magical relationship between plants and insects. All bees are covered in kind of electrostatically charged hairs that are really designed to pick up that pollen. So the pollen is almost like magnetically drawn to them as they visit the flowers. And you can see in this photo of a honeybee, honeybees also have these specialized sacs on their hind legs that are called corbicula. And these are designed so that the honeybee can press all of the pollen that's caught in her hairs and pack them into the little sacs on her legs. If you ever have a moment in the spring and summertime where you see bees visiting flowers, it's a really fascinating thing to observe. You can just kind of slow down, kind of zoom into that bee's eye view and watch the way that the bees collect the pollen and kind of push it into their leg sacs. It's very cool. So the foraging bees are out collecting bee pollen, and then they bring that back to the hive. Then there's worker bees inside of the hive that take the pollen from the foraging bees, and that pollen is mixed with a little bit of honey. And the other thing that honeybees do that is really fascinating is they ferment the pollen before they consume it. And we just think that's so interesting that the honeybees know how to use fermentation. So the pollen gets packed into cells inside the hive, and they add a little bit of honey and also, the addition of some enzymes from the bees' saliva and digestive system are included in that combination of honey, the natural yeast that's in the pollen, and the digestive enzymes from the honeybee causes this fermentation process to happen. And it turns into bee bread. And the bee bread is a really important source of nutrition within the honeybee colony. It's one of their most important sources of nutrition. All that honeybees eat are bee pollen and honey that they make from plant nectar. The pollen is super high in protein and micronutrients, and then that process of fermentation really helps all of the nutrients become more bioavailable for the honeybee colony. And bee pollen is collected by beekeepers by utilizing pollen traps. And there's a picture here from one of our beekeeping families demonstrating a bee pollen trap. And these are placed on the outside of the hive. So as the foraging bees return to the hive, the traps brush the pollen off of their legs. And the traps are left on the hives for short periods of time because it's very important to not have too big of an impact on the bees' food source. And that's a really important part of conscientious beekeeping is being very mindful of the honeybees' needs to be healthy and successful. And as the pollen is trapped, it's harvested usually all throughout the spring and summer, generally through many different seasons. So it'll be a wide variety of different types of plants that the bees might be foraging pollen from. As soon as it is collected by beekeepers, bee pollen is frozen because fresh bee pollen has kind of a high moisture content. At Mickelberry Gardens, we receive the bee pollen frozen and then we dry it at a super low temperature for packaging. We dry it low enough so that it is still a raw ingredient. That drying process helps to eliminate some of the moisture and help it to be more shelf stable. So, our bee pollen is exclusively sourced from beekeepers that we know and trust that are keeping bees in the Willamette Valley. It's a really beautiful, diverse region in the Pacific Northwest, harvested through multiple different seasons. So, a really wide variety and diversity of plant pollens. It's very colorful. Plant pollens come in all kinds of different colors. Oranges and yellows are really common, but you'll also see greens and purple and gray and pink. It's really fun to kind of look at all the different colors. It has a super sweet and floral taste. We, in our packaging, try to be really clear about exactly where our pollen comes from. We're getting it all from the Pacific Northwest from local beekeepers. A lot of packaging of bee pollen sometimes isn't super clear about where that pollen is sourced from, and where the pollen comes from is really important in terms of how healthy it is. There's a lot of bee products that come out of places like China, for example, where there's pesticides that are not legal in a lot of countries that are used there. So you want to be really mindful of where bee pollen is coming from. So we try to be very transparent about that. And our bee pollen is available in multiple sizes. We have glass jars, 3 different sizes of glass jars, 3 ounce, 6 ounce, and 11th ounce. And then we also offer it in bulk by the pound. Bee pollen has a lot of really amazing health benefits. It's been used for, thousands of years. Currently, one of its most popular uses is for people looking for relief from seasonal respiratory discomfort, symptoms of hay fever. Bee pollen is really useful. A lot of people find a lot of relief using it throughout the season that they tend to experience those symptoms. Bee pollen really kind of supports the liver to help kind of just calm the system down a bit and allow for, a lot of the external things that may be causing seasonal respiratory discomfort to just be less of an issue for your body. So that is a really great and popular way to use bee pollen. Bee pollen is also a really good source of energy. It's super calorie dense. There's a lot of calories in a very small quantity. So bee pollen is also really well known to provide energy, and it's really packed with nutrition. It's super dense in protein for its weight. It's really high in protein. It has a lot of vitamins, especially vitamins B and vitamin C. It's really high in minerals, iron in particular, and potassium. And then it also is really high in amino acids. So it's this really complete and perfect food that just provides an enormous amount of nutrition for a very small quantity, like a teaspoon is enough to get a large amount of nutrition. A lot of research has shown that bee pollen is great for building strength, both for athletes that are, maybe recovering or really, working their muscles really hard. Bee pollen can help with recovery. It also can really help build strength if someone is recovering from an illness or, anything that has kind of like weakened somebody. Bee pollen is really useful for helping to build back up that strength, that vital energy. Bee pollen is also known to be adaptogenic, which just means that it helps the body kind of more come into balance, be a little more prepared to handle whatever stresses that life may be sending your way. taking, small amounts of bee pollen over time can just have that adaptogenic effect, just really helping you adapt to your life situation where, once you may have been feeling really, really drained and low energy, it can help bring you back to feeling, really vital and able to handle things. And then bee pollen is really rich in antioxidants. It really helps to calm down oxidative stress that can cause a lot of damage throughout the body. Free radicals kind of bounce around and can cause damage. And these types of foods like bee pollen that are really high in antioxidants just really help protect from that. And there's quite an enormous amount of scientific research that supports all of these things that I've mentioned that bee pollen can be really useful for, and even some additional things. Bee pollen is super anti inflammatory, it's a broad antimicrobial, it can even protect the cardiovascular system. It's a prebiotic, so it has a lot of the nutrients that can really help with digestion. It's a really incredible superfood that is really well worth adding to your diet. We really like to recommend taking bee pollen on a regular basis. A teaspoon is a good serving size that we recommend. My favorite way to take bee pollen is to just sprinkle a little bit over granola with some yogurt. That's really delicious. You can also add it to smoothies. It incorporates really well into smoothies with a blender. You can also sprinkle it over salads or fruit. You can also just take it on its own by the spoonful. Some people like to do it that way because it is really a tasty and kind of interesting, unique flavor. So yeah, that's some of our favorite ways. We'd love to hear your favorite ways to consume bee pollen. Here we have a lot of citations for some of the research that I've mentioned. If you're interested in learning more, you can refer to a number of different research papers that are cited here. We really welcome you to come and visit our website to learn more about our company and visit our blog to read more about the benefits of bee pollen. Sign up for our newsletter to get more educational content. And thank you so much for listening.